Nature Revisited. Nature Revisited is a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we are pleased to welcome Josie Iselin to the podcast. Josie joins me to talk about her latest project, The Mysterious World of the Bull Kelp Forest. Josie Iselin is a photographer and an author who is passionate about the natural world and whose goal has been to look closer at that natural world to learn more about it and from it. The Mysterious World of the Bull Kelp Forest builds upon her previous books, The Curious World of Seaweed and The Ocean Garden, The Secret Life of Seaweed, where she uses art, science, and history to study the ocean's marine algae. Josie is also the co-director of Above Below, an oceanic literary campaign aimed at bringing the same attention to the bull kelp forests who exist under the waves that is afforded to the forest on land. Inspired to tell the story of the bull kelp of the Northwest Pacific Ocean, Above Below believes in the power of art and science to create a sense of wonder and to foster a curiosity about the ocean's bull kelp forests. Josie joins me from her home in San Francisco to share with us the mysterious world of the bull kelp forest. So Josie, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast, talking about your new book, The Mysterious World of Bull Kelp Forest.
I'm delighted to be here.
Let's start with, where are bull kelp forests and how does bull kelp differ from seaweed?
Kelp is a subset of the seaweeds. It is a big brown seaweed that is known both by scientists and by lay people alike as kelp. And every continent, especially up towards the poles in the temperate oceans, they all have their own kelp forest. The bull kelp, or Nereocystis lutkiana, on the northeastern edge of the Pacific. It runs along the coastal waters of Northern California, up through Oregon, the Pacific Northwest, through British Columbia, along the coast of Alaska, past Kodiak Island, and the biogeography, the range of the bull kelp ends in the middle of the Aleutian Islands. So the bull kelp is really the main subtidal ocean organizer for this part of the Pacific Northwest.
So when did you and why did you become fascinated with the bull kelp forests along the Pacific Northwest?
Well, my focus on bull kelp evolved from my fascination with seaweeds generally that began before 2010, when I happened to be out on some of the reefs around here in the Bay Area. There's one called the Duxbury Reef. And lots of people were talking about the critters that were out there, the nudibranchs and the starfish and the little fish caught in the tide pools. But nobody was talking about the seaweeds. I held up a piece of a red seaweed up to the sky, and it was like, as an artist, I was so astounded by the beauty and the form and the intensity of color of this scrap of seaweed I held. I brought it back to my studio and stuck it on my scanner, and then started scanning seaweeds like mad. And that included scanning kelp that I found on the beaches here in San Francisco that I walk very regularly. And the bull kelp washes up here. My regular beach walk got me really fascinated with the kelps and the seaweeds. And then my activities as an artist and putting them on the scanner allowed me to make what I called portraits. The seaweeds and the kelps were just not getting any attention, and yet they are so fantastically beautiful. The scanning led me into the questions about its life cycle and the natural history of these organisms. So I actually wrote a book called An Ocean Garden, The Secret Life of Seaweed. And I got to learn from a really fantastic taxonomist of the seaweeds in the Bay Area. Her name is Dr. Kathy Ann Miller, and she's the curator of algae over at UC Berkeley's. Spending time with her out in the low tides, learning the seaweeds and the kelps together really just enhanced my curiosity and my wanting to tell deeper stories about these organisms. So then I wrote a book called The Curious World of Seaweed, which focused on 16 kelps and seaweeds. And that book, The Curious World of Seaweed, dives into deeper history of the science, the natural history of 16 iconic seaweeds and kelp, and why they're interesting in terms of their success growing in the zone that they grow in. Out in this pretty intense environment where they get pounded by waves and they get dried out by sun if it's low tide. The second chapter of that book is the bull kelp chapter, the chapter on Nereocystis luedkiana, this particular kelp forest species that we're talking about. And as I was writing that chapter in about 2017, news of a very steep decline in the kelp forest here on the Northern California coast was just starting to hit the news. People started reading about it in the newspaper. And as I knew more and more about this amazing organism, I realized that its particular story had to be told. People needed to know more than just the cursory information they might pick up in a newspaper article. So I kind of challenged myself to say, how could I tell a really holistic story about the bull kelp, about this particular organism that is so foundational to nearshore ocean health? At that time, I happened to meet a wonderful designer named Mariana Leuschel, and she was just getting interested in the kelp herself. She did not know that it was hitting tough times. And she and I put our heads together and said, you know what, let's make a website. Over the next couple of years, wrote a very long form, what we call a web-based book almost, but it's very, very visual. And we immediately looked to Ellen Litweiler, and we looked to her as an illustrator and said, Ellen, we need a fantastic homepage. That web story, bullkelp.info, is really the source of this book, The Mysterious World of the Bull Kelp Forest. It is where we can tell the whole story, where anyone who's concerned about these issues that are facing our oceans today can get this kind of holistic, deep dive, baseline understanding of this very complex system that we call the kelp forest. So that's a very long answer, but it's been a focus that's built on this foundation of seaweed storytelling generally.
So why do these places called Bull Kelp Forests, why do they matter?
They matter just the way forests in our terrestrial world matter. They have two basic functions that are what I would say foundational. Number one, these are photosynthesizing organisms using the power of sunlight and the nutrients of the oceans to create biomass. As primary producers, they are the bottom of the food chain. So marine algae is a term I'll use for seaweeds and kelp, the macroalgae that grows in the oceans, the marine algae. This algal matter is what snails and limpets and crabs and so many organisms actually feed on. And these tend to be organisms that are low on the food chain. And then these organisms in turn get eaten by higher level organisms. It's the kelp forests that are really the base of this complex and interwoven marine food web. They also create habitat. They are eco-engineers. This is where the larval stages of so many organisms, such as the sea urchin and the abalone and starfish, they need a place to be safe. And they tend to be attracted to these complex three-dimensional structures that the kelp forests create. They also are where fish go to find prey, but they're also where fish go to avoid predation. So the kelp forests are in turn a place where the larger mammals, say, think seals and sea otters, will go to look for food, where seals will look for fish, where sea otter will look for urchin, also where seabirds will dive for the smaller fish that school in the kelp forests. I keep coming back to the word foundational, like the forests, like the grasses on land. They are where all these organisms tend to congregate for sustenance and also for protection.
How would you describe the Bull Kelp Forest and the community that lives in them?
I would describe it as rich, fecund, luscious, joyful. It's the abundance in biodiversity that we all are craving in our world right now. As the notion of biodiversity gets whittled away at, so many habitats get reduced. The bull kelp forests are those places where color and shape and form will overwhelm a diver. One of the big problems is we can't hike into a kelp forest like we can into the forest on land. We know how rich that forest is. The same is true for forests underwater, the ocean forests. If you were down on the bottom, there would be red coralline algae and there would be sponges. There would be all sorts of red urchin and purple urchin. There would be abalone, starfish of all different colors. So I think we have to really remember that these kelp forests are about biodiversity, about richness of life.
How are they being threatened?
I might go into a little bit of life cycle first. One of the interesting things about bull kelp is an annual species. That means tremendous amount of growth just in one season. It's these longer days of sunlight in the spring that are sparking this new growth, and then these rich ocean nutrients that we hope will start coming with the upwelling phenomenon when the winds pop up and push the surface waters away and let the deep, nutrient-dense, colder waters come up from beyond the continental shelf. That upwelling is crucial for this really stupendous growth that this bull kelp is going to start. Could grow maybe 40 feet in over just a few months. It might grow 10 or 12 inches a day if the conditions are right. And those conditions mean cold ocean. Cold ocean holds more nutrients than warm ocean. And these organisms need a tremendous amount of renewed nutrients every day because by July, these tiny baby kelps that are out there today will be 40-foot behemoths. They will be 35 pounds of tough kelp algal biomass that has reached the surface. And so in summertime, you'll see these mature kelp laid out across the surface of the ocean, especially at low tide, with their blades dangling down. And if you're snorkeling or diving, you're seeing the sun come through these golden blades, and it's just stupendously beautiful. But in the later summer, they have to carry out their reproductive project before the winter storms pick up these bull kelp and throw them as wrack onto the shores. They produce these spore patches that are dark brown that accumulate on the blades, and actually the blades are kind of like a conveyor belt. As these spore patches ripen, they move out to the ends of the blade and then eventually just drop away as a packet of spores that falls to the ocean bottom and disperses. There's actually another part of the life cycle that takes place down on the ocean bottom after these spores have dispersed. Leave it to say it happens down there in the dark, cold, rocky bottom during the winter, and come springtime again, you have these baby bull kelp coming up. They need cold ocean. They need a bountiful amount of nutrients. Warming oceans are a huge stressor on the kelp. That is one overriding concern for kelp forests throughout the globe, is warming oceans. The other concern is an imbalance in the predator and prey relationships, or what's called the trophic food web of the kelp ecology. There are herbivores, those organisms that love to eat the kelp, namely sea urchin and abalone, that are part of every kelp forest in the globe. But if the balance gets out of whack, there can be an overpopulation of urchin in particular. And urchin are just voracious. They can overgraze a kelp forest down to nothing. And it actually will shift from this very vibrant, biodiverse kelp forest into what's called an urchin barren. We had an event in 2014 where sea star wasting disease decimated the populations of sea stars. The sea star that was most effective and has not made any comeback from that massive die-off is the sunflower sea star, or Pycnopodia helianthoides. And the sunflower sea star is this really fascinating organism that can grow to 2 feet wide, as big as a pizza. It has 20 arms, and it's a voracious urchin predator. And it did a very good job at keeping sea urchin populations in control. And when that predator disappeared from ocean waters, literally overnight, because of this sea star wasting disease, it released those urchin from predation. And this happened to happen at a time when there was also a massive warming ocean event that was already stressing out the kelp and reducing kelp numbers. It's interesting to look at the Washington coast, where the bull kelp is actually doing pretty well. Offshore Washington has a robust population of sea otters. And sea otter are the second predator of urchin that keep kelp forests resilient and healthy. Historically, before the 1850s, 2 top predators, the sea otter and the sunflower sea star. By the 1890s, the sea otters were completely wiped out by the fur trade. So sea otters have not been in the ecology except for in certain places, such as the Monterey Peninsula or the coast of Washington state, and also in Southeast Alaska and the northern part of British Columbia. There are sea otters in those kelp forests. As a result, the bull kelp is doing okay in those places. It's really fascinating to me, and I think it's important for all of us to say, oh, what's happening somewhere else, whether it's the next cove up the coast, or whether it's the next state, or whether it's the next country, and learn from those places.
So how important is the relationship between rockfish and salmon to the bull kelp forest?
We put in rockfish and salmon into this storytelling because it's so important to point out that all these ecologies are connected. Rockfish is a fish that lots of people like to eat, but they are very dependent on kelp forests because they don't move around a lot. They find a spot, and that's kind of where they stay. That rockfish can live to be 200 years old. There are many different species of rockfish, but generally they can grow to be very old fish. It's also important to know that as rockfish age, they become much more fecund. They're producing exponentially more young rockfish. So it's really important for rockfish populations to have those old mamas and grandmamas out there in the kelp forest producing their offspring. But it takes a rockfish 25 years to get to that mature age to start reproducing. And they live in the kelp forest. Salmon need a place to hide when they come out of the rivers and become ocean-going fish for the first time. They're young, they're juvenile, they have to adapt to the salt water, and they need a place to hide. They're highly vulnerable to predation. The bull kelp does not seem to mind the freshwater effluent from rivers. So you will often find these kelp forests right at the exits of the rivers. So it's a natural place for these young salmon to go and congregate. It's really important that people who are interested in salmon also be interested in the kelp forest. Everything is connected. Shorebirds and seabirds, they too are connected to the kelp forest. I wanted to put in one of the cormorants because they are intimately tied to the kelp forest because that's where they dive for fish, for that forage fish. And they're foraging right in the kelp forest. The connections from shore to sea is so important for us to know. And that connection goes below the lid of the tide. It goes down under the water where we can't see. One of the key ways that a lot of groups are assessing ocean health is by assessing seabird population. And you can survey nests and success rates of fledgling bird populations.
So speaking of connections, how has the Bull Kelp Forest been connected to the human factor, going back to Indigenous and First Nation people to the present day?
There is something known as the Kelp Highway, which is pretty accepted now as the method by which peoples populated the North American continent. They probably came down the coast where you have this abundance of protein. First Nations and tribes have been collecting seaweed and clams and forage food from the coast for millennia and have stewarded their nearshore ocean bounty like they did the lands. There's some studies of clam gardens, especially up in Canada and Vancouver, that have been uncovered at the low tides where terraces were created to create clam farms. One of the things that's interesting to me is that because the sea otter have been out of the system for so long, tribal ecologists are trying to remember or relearn or figure out how tribes and First Nations interacted with the sea otter in pre-contact times to make sure that there was enough for all. Because one of the interesting things about our human relation to the sea otter is that we like the same things. They will eat abalone, and we know that abalone is an absolutely crucial element to tribal culture. There was probably some methodology to how they were hunted to keep their population in check. That is yet to be teased out. There are some people working up at Simon Fraser University in Canada doing some really interesting work there. I think what's been so interesting is that it was an organism that had no commercial value when I started writing about it. So it didn't get a lot of attention. That's been really important and been part of why the seaweeds and kelp are suddenly drawing all this fascination, because we realize we've left it alone. And as a result, we didn't realize and appreciate it until it started to really show that it was disappearing. Our science and art communities coming together has been a really important way to tell these stories. Realizing the incredible connectivity between it all is something that poetry and art and science can do together very effectively. Something I'm really passionate about is telling these stories in different ways, whether it's through this book, whether it's through the website, whether it's through these art exhibits that incorporate sound and visuals. There are films out there that are doing amazing work in telling the story. We are tied to this Bull Kelp Forest just like all these other organisms. We are part of the drama, and we have to start treating it like we're related to it, like it's kin, to get to know it and understand it as well as we can.
So what is kelp rack, and what can it tell us?
Rack is what is pushed up on shore when the tide comes up to its topmost point and then recedes, and what it deposits there, its residue, is the rack line. Often that rack line is full of seaweed, and it is where it will deposit these great piles of bull kelp when they are tossed there at the end of their life cycle, especially with winter storms. After the winter storms, in a healthy kelp year, you'll have great tangles of bull kelp up on the shore. And this is in turn bringing all that carbon and nutrients up into the shore ecology. It's like a bonus benefit to our nearshore dune ecologies. Bull kelp on the beach will be eaten by all sorts of flies and invertebrates and isopods, and those insects are in turn a fantastically important food source for shorebirds and seabirds, especially migrating seabirds that need all that caloric intake. One of the other things talking about kelp rack that's, I think, important is that it allows us to mention the notion of the carbon cycle that this kelp is so much a part of. Right now, we are looking for places to sequester carbon wherever we can. And there's a lot of mention of kelp as a factor in terms of carbon sequestration because it does photosynthesize very quickly. It is drawing in that CO2 and respirating that oxygen. And it is creating a carbon-based biomass very rapidly. But it is also degenerating very rapidly. And that is something that the kelps and seaweeds do, is that they not only grow quickly, but they degenerate very quickly. In a healthy kelp forest with plenty of kelp, that slough, those bits that are constantly falling off the kelp, creates this snow in the water that drifts down to the bottom and feeds the detritivores, which is the sea urchins and the abalone. On the beach, the kelp does the same thing. It degenerates pretty quickly. And that carbon is actually going back into these nearshore ecologies and fertilizing dune plants and is this huge benefit to the health of beach ecology.
So what are some of the important stories that are playing out along the Pacific Northwest coastline that are impacting the Bull Kelp Forest?
There are some really great restoration stories happening because of this imbalance in the system that we're seeing with the overabundance of the purple sea urchin and slightly warmer oceans. We have an absolute swelling of interest and funding and organization around experimental kelp restoration. And I say experimental because relative to all of the work that's been done in forests on land, forests in the ocean have just been studied for decades as opposed to centuries. Restoration work is happening by many different people and at many different levels. And one thing I have to point out, because it's just part of this very complex story, is that these purple sea urchin don't die. They starve, but they don't die. And they sit on the bottom as these zombie urchin. There's no caloric value to any of these urchin. So finding the right place to do this restoration and recovery work, and then soliciting volunteers, commercial fishermen, expert divers. There's just a tremendous amount of energy happening around this activity. And it's very, very exciting. And it involves community college students and tribes who are training their own tribal members to be the survey divers and scientific divers. Another story that's just come up in the paper recently that is going to affect these projects and the Bull Kelp Forest is an ocean warming event. We have the possibility of an El Nino coming. These warming ocean events are very stressful to the kelp and will be a test as to whether the recovery efforts and human-led restoration efforts can build enough resilience in these core pockets of the bull kelp for resilience against these warming ocean events, because the warm ocean stresses the kelp. And we will also be watching this summer for when the winds come up here where I live in San Francisco and everybody in this kind of part of the world. The last 2 years, we've had tremendous amounts of wind. And what that meant was that we had very good upwelling happening. That wind pushes the surface waters away and allows nutrient-dense, cold, deep water to rise to the surface. And that fuels the microalgae as well as all of the seaweeds and kelps and fuels their growth. If the winds don't pick up and it gets very warm, it kind of puts this lid on upwelling and it doesn't get to the surface. And that will put stress on all of this ocean growth.
So finally, where can someone learn more about some of the restoration efforts that are taking place, such as the Ocean Literary Campaign Above Below?
Thanks for that. I hope that everyone can get involved in the way that they can. Above Below is the partnership of myself and my partner, Mariana Loischel. And we built the website, The Mysterious World of Bull Kelp at bullkelp.info. And there is a whole side of that website that explains how the restoration work is done. But each of the regional pages has a list of resources, and these are links to recovery efforts, all sorts of resources that can deepen your understanding of the Bull Kelp Forest in that region and also link you to places to volunteer and help. So that's the one-stop shop Bull Kelp website. There's a conference every year that tries to share knowledge called the EPAC, and the proceedings of that are also on the bullkelp.info website. And I encourage anyone to get in touch with me, and I can put them in touch with fantastic network of ocean-oriented scientists. And I also want to just make a plug here also for those of you who aren't scientists, that making art has become a really effective way of engaging a community with this world that we can't see under the ocean. Art making, poetry, writing of all sorts. We are just having a great time getting this story out there, and we're so glad for everyone who is listening in.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Josie Iselin, and that you take the opportunity to read her latest book, The Mysterious World of the Bull Kelp Forest, which is beautifully illustrated by Ellen Litwiller. If you are interested in learning more about the bull kelp, please visit bullkelp.info, as well as josieiselin.com. Norden Productions would also like to announce the publication of Nature Revisited, Stories of Hope for a Planet and Its People. Nature Revisited, the book, is a collection and celebration of 20 interviews from the first 6 years of the podcast. 20 incredible interviews transcribed from episodes with people such as Ursula Goodenough, Doug Talmy, Camille Dungy, and Kurt Meany, to name a few. People who are making a difference in the way we perceive our relationship with nature and the natural world, and who are helping to shape our future. It is beautifully illustrated by Minnesota artist Mark Granlund and is available through your local bookstore, nordenproductions.com, jeffryanauthor.com, or Amazon. If you enjoyed this episode of Nature Revisited, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website, nordenproductions.com. And please share your comments and suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for this episode is The Machine in the Garden by Ben Cosgrove from his album, The Trouble with Wilderness. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.